The next speaker is Professor Jim McManus. Jim is a public health director in Hertfordshire. He is also a chartered psychologist and associated fellow of the British Psychological Society. He's visiting senior clinical fellow at the University of Hertfordshire and a visiting fellow at Heythrop College in London, particularly interested in the links between psychology, health and faith. During the pandemic, Jim has been enormously busy, not only running the public health element of a pandemic in his own area, but advising the government on it as well. And I'm enormously grateful, as he is also the president of the Guild of Health in St. Raphael and has offered us support during the pandemic. He's extremely busy man. You've seen Harry Potter, you know the thing that Hermione has, that can wind time back and get more time in the day. I'm sure Jim's got one of those in his pocket. That's how he does so much. So Jim, thank you so much for joining us and for your willingness to tackle these three questions from your particular point of view.
Thank you. It's a delight to speak, although I confess part of me wants just to sit for an hour and think about what Alan said, because it was so rich and full of insight. And I think I do hope this is being recorded, because I want to listen to that again. And I'm not even going to attempt to say anything other than what Alan said, but since I've got time, and I never knowingly want to shut up or speak anyway. We're in St. Paul's Church, which I think is providential, not coincidental, not just because of the richness we've heard about the experience, and particularly the issues about leadership and crisis, but because for me in the Catholic tradition, St. Paul is the patron saint of communications. And Father James Alberioni founded the Society of St. Paul, which is all about communications. And recently, the last time I was at the English College, where, God help them, the seminarians had to listen to me talking about pastoral psychology for 4 days. I mean, what a thing to diss people. We had an afternoon off, and the seminarians upon them were taking bets that I was going to spend my afternoon in the bookshops, in the Vatican radio station, and a quick trip to the Vatican Observatory. And they were absolutely right. The only thing they missed out was the ice cream. But the Second Vatican Council, way back in 1963, had a decree, posh word, on the media of social communication, and it was called Inter Mirifica in the way that Vatican documents often are, which means among the wonderful. And basically, it started with an attitude of openness to the things that social media brings to us, because they are part of the technology and the gift of God's world. And then said, but they need pastoral directive. And then said, the responsibility of the church is to monitor the use of them and ensure the spiritual well-being of the church community at large. And I'm reading the main themes here. And then said, the responsibility of the individual is to ensure their own well-being and ensure they're not causing themselves or others spiritual harm. And then talked about the responsibility of the media. And I just heard everything Alan's saying, chiming with that frame, that these are a gift, they're not a magic bullet, and they're not a panacea. And most of us will wonder maybe how we've gone from clapping the NHS to having anti-vaxxers standing out schools, frightening children that they're going to die. I mean, I do. I have 600 schools in my patch, and it is a real issue. And I pride myself on trying to reply to every email from every resident in my county, because, you know, I have to be transparent. That sometimes means 300 a day. We have a major challenge from COVID, and I think hybrid isn't a resurrection moment. I think COVID might be, and I hope it is. Otherwise, my last slide is a waste of time. The pandemic has moved us backwards in many ways. COVID has not been an equal opportunities virus. It has killed the most vulnerable. It has killed the poorest, and it has killed disproportionately. And more diseases will emerge. The graph you can see there shows where novel infections are most likely to emerge. The bluer, the more likely we are to see things. And pandemics are accelerating. It was 1957, big pandemic. Then we had 2002 SARS, 2009 swine flu, 2013 MERS, 2019 COVID, all coronaviruses. It's going to happen again. COVID is not unprecedented, nor is the church's use of communications if St. Paul has anything to teach us. And I do believe St. Paul has a lot to teach us, but that's another story. We have been here before. We will be here again. The history of the church's presence in infectious diseases, we built most hospitals. Many hospitals in medieval Europe were built by the church for people with syphilis. We need to remember that during pilgrim routes. The church remains the biggest provider of HIV care in the world and one of the biggest providers of elderly care. So I think we are being called by God to continue our participation in the ministry of Christ. And Nuala Kenny, who is a nun and a paediatrician, I bet you her parties are a hoot, and she's Canadian, has written a book called A Post-Pandemic Church, where she says, you know, we have an opportunity for new life in Christ that cannot be ignored. And if we take anything from the richness of Alan, that can't just be online. It has to be a both and, because the Spirit won't be constrained to online. Neither should the church be. So I'm going to give you a couple of theses, because, you know, we all like a good thesis on a Saturday morning, don't we? I think hybrid church has multiple factors to it if we are to do it well. And I think I'm speaking from a public health and a psychology perspective, but partly theological. And it's difficult sometimes for me to divide them now. There's an equality and social justice and inclusion element to online work. I did 600 webinars during COVID, including webinars for social care staff. And training people in post-traumatic stress online. I never want to do that again. I'm glad we did it. I don't want to do it again. There's a safety element, there's a theological element, and there's a strong missiological element. The beautiful story Alan told about incorporating, including, and belonging, starting online and continuing online. Yeah, that was just moving. So that's a thesis that because COVID isn't going away, we need to reckon with hybrid church and mission. It has created a social movement. The second one is that there are a series of leadership tasks in hybrid church, and they're not that different from the history of pastoral care, which is healing, nurturing, guiding, reconciling, and discipline. And I'd say, and by discipline, I mean the lifelong discipline we build of discipleship. And underpinning all of that is safeguarding. The church can't be one holy Catholic or apostolic if it isn't safe. I often say I believe in one holy Catholic and dysfunctional church, but that's another story. And I think there are big trends which mission has to consider, and you can see my spelling's gone awry. There's all the epidemiological stuff. There's the death and disease, the social and cultural change, the fact that COVID was a major collective trauma, economic trends and so on, and the move to hybrid. We faced this before as church through huge shifts. I remember when the Divine Office, the Liturgy of the Hours came online with an app called Universalis. I still prefer the books, but I do use the app. Cardinal Sarah, who's not so much pre-Vatican II as pre-Trent, said we should never use online tools for prayer because they're not sacred enough. They're not sacred to the books. And I dug something out because this is the kind of person I am that basically had somebody in the Middle Ages saying books were evil and the work of Satan. There's not a lot new under the sun. The common good, and apologies that this talk is very Catholic, but that's who I am. The common good, the bishops of the church in England and Wales, the Catholic Church said, nothing is beyond the scope of faith. And if you look at Catholic social teaching that was steeped in, we've all heard the word subsidiarity, haven't we? Which means it's an excuse for any government to leave the building and leave it to local government when it can't be bothered. That's been my experience of the last 18 months. There's actually, that's vertical subsidiarity is the level at which things are done. Horizontal subsidiarity is the networks of trust, love, participation, and inclusion. And Alan spoke richly of that. We need horizontal subsidiarity and participation among us, online and in person, to be a real social community. There's huge wisdom in Christian faith if we but look to our best traditions. And the beauty of the Guild is it looks to multiple traditions and is so inclusive and is a sign of God's enduring love. I genuinely believe that about this organisation. I'm going to skip these slides because I've spoken about them. But I'm going to make 2 points: that COVID was not a pandemic, it was a syndemic. It was multiple waves of impact that started with fear, started with the virus, went on to death, is now showing itself in enduring mental health distress, enduring long-term problems, including financial problems, delays in getting operations, multiple waves. And that extremely well done diagram, not on the slide, is an example of how it was a syndemic. You can think about most major global diseases. They are syndemic in their effects. We are dealing with a syndemic. And the move to hybrid, I've got a colleague who says every time he approaches his laptop, he has a sense of impending Zoom and his intrusiveness is both a blessing and a risk. COVID was messy. The syndemic will be and is messy. Our response will be messy. And we are going through a collective major trauma. There is no other way of explaining it. Grief in some people, in the words of Justin Welby, has turned to grievance and deep grievance. And we can see, and I'm rushing through these slides, but you are welcome to have copies of these and use them to make a point. I'm using them to make a point. But you can see, if you look at multiple waves of COVID, the Centre for Mental Health, that used to be called the Sainsbury Centre for Mental Health, has done some really great economic modelling on mental health need goes up with every wave of uncontrolled infection. And in fact, controlling COVID is better for the economy than letting it rip through. You know, if you look at The Economist, I read The Economist and the Church Times and a number of other things regularly, and their economic coverage of COVID has been amongst the best and most consistent. So we face a big challenge, and that multiple challenge and syndemic makes up the resurrection, and hybrid is one little bit of that. And there are lessons from psychology and the sciences. Much of the work done on hybrid has really been done in organizational psychology, but there's a thing called the social identity cure. It's how our shared identity takes us through trauma and builds our identity. And if you have been oppressed, if you have been bullied, if you are part of a group, and we can see it perhaps with LGBTQ residents and citizens, we can see it with asylum seekers, we can see it with refugees. You can see that their social identity can be a really positive thing. When you welcome 5 busloads of Afghan refugees, some of whom have still got barbed wire wounds from Kabul airport, which is an experience I recently had, their sense of identity was probably the biggest thing they had going for them when they walked into our, when they, arrived in our county in a bus. How we get them through that is a major task for us. And I think the social identity cure can work for us as well online. Our sense of identity. And it was a beautiful story of how you did that online. I've been a part of online church and online communities which have been dreadful, and I've been a part of things that have been wonderful during COVID. There are leadership tasks in building these communities and networks of love and care and trust. And hybrid church has an opportunity. Ivan Robertson and Kerry Cooper, who kind of tend to write a book before breakfast every morning, have done a lot of work on hybrid church, and there are blogs online on hybrid organisations. I'm not sure their stuff fits directly into what we do as church for all the reasons Alan has pointed out. There are benefits to hybrid. Those who cannot do can be included because they are valuable for who they are and their being. Those who are sick or housebound can be regarded as a precious gift from God to the church to teach us something profound about the nature of living with chronic illness. We can reach more diverse people, we can be agile, we can be present even in cyberspace, but in a world of Bayesian random statistics, and I hesitate to say this with Gillian, who's got a PhD in physics in front of me, presence and joining is often Bayesian, it's random. That has benefits as well as risks. Opportunities for the spirit, risks for harm. It is a new frontier for mission, but let's not over-egg it. I think we can say it's grace abundant. You know, reckless, lavish grace of God that God wants to share with us. That's what gets me out of the bed in the morning. The spirit's not going to be constrained, so why should our mission be? The downside is it creates hierarchies of participation and inclusion. You're always on. It's intrusive. If the BBC want you, they can find you when you're in the gym, which is my experience, usually in the middle of deadlifting, but that's another story. And it brings burnout. There are big theological issues, which I won't dwell on, but is the church a setting for sacraments, or is the church a sacramental setting? So there's a book by Michael Schmaus, which makes me giggle, and his friends did call him Mickey, where he explores the Catholic concept of the church as sacrament. He actually talks about Christ as the primal sacrament, the church as a sacrament of Christ's presence. And that gives us a context for healing and mission and inclusion and all the other sacraments. You don't go to Mass, you're part of a church which celebrates Mass as part of its identity. And if I can't come to Mass, I know that others are there celebrating the Eucharist for me. That's a massive theological opportunity for us to restate church for people who don't want to go every Sunday morning. It's an opportunity to align our sense of church with our sense of mission and our sense of healing. And I hark back to Gillian's lecture the last time we met in person about reuniting healing and mission. I talked about thesis 2. I'm convinced to be published in statistics, you have to have a German name, and to be published in Catholic theology, you have to be dead and have a German or a Dutch name. So Schmaus talked about Christ as the source. Schielebix talked about Christ as the sacrament of the encounter with God. It puts liturgy into a whole different world. Because as a Catholic, I grew up, you know, in the sort of Scottish Catholicism, which is not exactly fundamentalist, because they would regard them as lightweights. It is a sort of, you know, you go to Mass, you do whatever a nun tells you. And the idea of not going to Mass is kind of like, and it is physically painful not receiving the Eucharist. I don't know if anybody else feels that. It actually hurts not being able to have the Eucharist. But to reimagine church's sacrament is so liberating and so supportive. We have an opportunity. Moving very quickly on, I think there is a leadership role in this. I'm not going to explain that, but I do think it needs us to reevaluate our leadership, to look at the context we're in and the multiplicity of skills. And there's a whole other session in that. And I commend you the Ashridge model of leadership because it has helped me survive. I'll just skip briefly because I want to recover some time. There are leadership tasks in this. A theology of hybrid church needs to revisit what we mean by inclusion, healing, and mission. It needs to start in safeguarding, and it needs to realize that it is not an either or, it is a both and. Psychological safety needs to start and be included. And actually, both science and theology are equally important in building hybrid church. The psychology of how we encounter one another online, the psychology of human communications, the psychology of leadership. These are all opportunities. And I want to commend to you Pope Francis's Laudato Si, because I'm a bit tired of the science theology debate sometimes, because it seems to get into a sort of, well, it's either science or theology. And it's like, as a Catholic, my respect for science is that it is a gift of God for us to live. Otherwise, I wouldn't be a scientist. And therefore, how we use science as a basis for doing theology is crucial and important, which is one of the reasons I think the stuff that the Guild does is so crucial. And therefore, the use of science in theology to actually inform our theology and our mission. And I've gone full circle back to Inter Mirifica and the founding of the Congregation of St. Paul by James Alberione. That, for me, is a lesson for today. That was a lesson they learned in the 30s. I think it is a lesson that we as church can relearn now. So is this a resurrection moment? It could be for all things, COVID and for church. I think God is offering us something that has risks as well as downsides. And just to remind myself of the questions again before, because I've probably forgotten them, and I hope I answer all three, that the pastoral questions are multiple, but so are the pastoral questions that face us already, and we have to take them together. There is rich learning. Everywhere you look in God's church, the Spirit is creating learning. And that's what I heard this morning. So we have more opportunity, and I think in the spirit of Inter Mirifica, let's put out into the waters. Duc in altum, says the gospel. Let's put out into the deep and trust and hold one another in trust and accountability. And let's explore how we get. And as a dysfunctional church, we'll screw up. But as long as we're aware of that, we'll make it safe. Thank you for listening.